The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through the Birmingham courthouse steps like a gunshot. Ruby Elizabeth Stone's head snapped sideways, her briefcase exploding open, legal documents scattering across the Alabama morning like autumn leaves. Officer Robert Sullivan's hand still burned from the impact as he grabbed her throat, slamming her against the courthouse wall with enough force to rattle the bronze nameplate above, Birmingham Civil Rights District Court. "Filthy animals like you don't belong in courthouses," Sullivan snarled, his breath hot against her ear as metal handcuffs bit into her wrists. "Know your place." Ruby's grandmother's voice whispered through the pain. "Dignity, baby. They can take your freedom, but never your character." 20 feet away, through the glass doors, her own courtroom waited. Her nameplate gleamed on the judge's bench. The Honorable Judge Ruby Elizabeth Stone, 23 years of service. They said a black woman didn't belong in their courthouse. 23 years later, she owned it. Sullivan had no idea he'd just assaulted the most powerful person in the building. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning had begun like any other Tuesday for Ruby Elizabeth Stone. At 58, she maintained the same routine that had sustained her through 23 years on the federal bench. Wake at 5:30, coffee with 2 sugars while reading case briefs, then the 20-minute drive through Birmingham's historic district to the courthouse where she presided over the Civil Rights District Court. Ruby carried the weight of history in her very DNA. Her grandmother, Essie Mae Washington, had walked alongside Rosa Parks during the Montgomery bus boycott. Her late grandfather had been personal counsel to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., drafting legal strategies in the basement of 16th Street Baptist Church. The framed photograph on her chamber's desk showed 3 generations of Stone women. Essie Mae in her church dress, Ruby's mother Clara in her nurse's uniform, and Ruby herself in judicial robes, each representing a different chapter of America's long march toward justice. Officer Robert "Bobby" Sullivan started his shift that morning carrying ghosts of his own. 25 years had passed since his father, Sergeant Michael Sullivan, was gunned down in what Bobby believed was a drug raid gone wrong. The official report stated Officer Sullivan died in the line of duty, shot by an armed suspect. What it didn't mention was the suspect's race, but Bobby's uncle had filled in those details during angry whispered conversations at family gatherings. "Your daddy died because of them," Uncle Pat would say, his Irish accent thick with whiskey and resentment. "Don't you ever forget who took him from us." Bobby carried his father's badge in his wallet, the metal worn smooth from decades of nervous handling. Each traffic stop, each arrest, each confrontation became a chance to honor that memory, to show he wouldn't let them win again. His 20-year career was built on a foundation of inherited hatred, disguised as law and order. The Birmingham Civil Rights District Court stood as a monument to progress, its walls lined with photographs of freedom riders and civil rights lawyers who had transformed the South. Ruby knew every face in those photographs. Some had been family friends, others her legal heroes. She had specifically requested assignment to this courthouse when appointed to the federal bench, understanding that justice delayed was justice denied, and that someone who understood the struggle needed to ensure it never happened again. That morning, Bobby Sullivan and Ruby Stone were about to collide at the intersection of past and present, where old wounds and new possibilities would determine whether Birmingham had truly changed or whether some battles still needed fighting. Neither knew their lives were about to be forever altered by a case of mistaken identity that would expose 20 years of buried truth. Ruby Elizabeth Stone had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blazer and pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that respect was earned through consistency, not demanded through volume. Her briefcase contained the morning's case files, including a sentencing hearing for a young man caught dealing drugs near the high school where her late husband had once worked as a volunteer coach. At 8:45, Ruby approached the courthouse steps, the same steps where her grandfather had once been barred from entering during the segregation era. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now presided over the very building that had once denied her family justice. She walked slowly, savoring the morning air and the weight of history that surrounded this place. Officer Bobby Sullivan was having a different kind of morning. His shift supervisor had already chewed him out for 3 citizen complaints filed the previous week, all involving what the department euphemistically called communication issues with minority suspects. His captain's words still stung. "One more incident, Sullivan, and you're looking at suspension without pay." Bobby's response had been the same one he'd given for 20 years. He was just doing his job, protecting good citizens from criminals who didn't respect authority. When Bobby saw Ruby approaching the courthouse, his trained eye immediately cataloged what he perceived as suspicious behavior. A black woman in business attire, walking purposefully toward a government building, carrying what appeared to be expensive legal documents. In his experience, this meant one of 3 things: activist, lawyer, or someone running a con. All 3 made him instinctively defensive. "Excuse me, ma'am," Bobby called out, positioning himself between Ruby and the courthouse entrance. "I need to see some identification." Ruby paused, surprised by the interruption. She had been thinking about Marcus, the young man she would be sentencing that morning, wondering if there was still time to redirect his life toward something meaningful. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm expected inside. I have a hearing at 9. Bobby's expression hardened. 20 years of policing had taught him that criminals always had an excuse, always claimed they belonged somewhere they didn't. "That's not what I asked you. I said I need to see identification. Now." The tone struck Ruby like a physical blow. She had heard it before, in her childhood, when white store clerks followed her mother through aisles, when teachers questioned whether she really belonged in advanced placement classes. But she hadn't heard it directed at her personally in decades. The shock of regression was profound. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I really do need to get inside." "Perhaps you could walk with me to security if you have concerns." Ruby reached into her briefcase to retrieve her judicial identification. "Don't reach for anything." Bobby's hand moved instinctively to his weapon. "Step away from the bag and put your hands where I can see them." The escalation happened with terrifying speed. Ruby froze, her hand halfway into her briefcase, watching as Bobby's entire demeanor shifted from suspicious to aggressive. Around them, early morning commuters began to slow their pace, phones emerging from pockets as the universal human instinct to record conflict activated. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," Ruby said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm Judge Ruby Stone. I work in this building." Bobby's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "Right, and I'm the governor of Alabama. You people always have some story, always claim to be somebody important when you get caught where you don't belong." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like poison gas. Ruby felt something inside her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a deep, familiar sadness that such moments still existed in 2024. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, "When they show you who they are, believe them the first time." "Ma'am, you're trespassing on federal property. You need to leave immediately or you'll be placed under arrest." Bobby stepped closer, his bulk intimidating, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. Ruby straightened to her full height, drawing on 23 years of judicial experience and 70 years of Stone family resilience. "Officer, I'm going to reach very slowly into my briefcase and show you my identification. My name is Ruby Elizabeth Stone, and I am the presiding judge of this courthouse." But Bobby had already made his decision. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him for. A suspicious individual refusing to comply with lawful orders, claiming false authority to avoid consequences. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Never let them think they're in charge, son. The moment you show weakness, they'll walk all over you. That's it. You're under arrest for trespassing, failure to comply with a lawful order, and attempting to impersonate a federal official. Bobby grabbed Ruby's wrist with unnecessary force, spinning her around to face the courthouse wall. The briefcase fell to the ground, its contents spilling across the steps. Legal briefs with judicial letterhead, sentencing guidelines, and a framed photograph of Ruby with the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Documents that would have immediately resolved the misunderstanding scattered in the morning breeze like evidence of a crime that existed only in Bobby's prejudiced imagination. As the handcuffs clicked around Ruby's wrists, she felt the cold metal against skin that had never known such restraint. Her grandmother had been arrested during the bus boycotts. Her mother had been arrested during sit-ins. Now, Ruby herself was being arrested on the steps of the courthouse, where she had spent more than 2 decades ensuring that justice was truly blind. "You have the right to remain silent," Bobby began, his voice mechanically reciting words he had spoken thousands of times. But Ruby's silence wasn't born of legal strategy. It came from a place deeper than shock, a recognition that some fights required patience. Some battles demanded perfect timing. 20 feet away, through the glass doors of the courthouse, her nameplate gleamed on the judge's bench, waiting for her return. Inside courtroom 3B, temporary Judge William Harrison reviewed the morning docket with the weary expression of a man who had seen too many similar cases. At 62, Harrison had spent 30 years in family court before being called upon to fill in for judges on medical leave or vacation. Today he was covering for Judge Stone, who had apparently been delayed by some morning emergency. The bailiff, Thomas Henderson, had worked this courthouse for 15 years. He knew every judge, every clerk, every regular attorney who passed through these halls. When Officer Sullivan dragged in a handcuffed black woman claiming to be Judge Stone, Henderson felt something cold settle in his stomach. The woman's posture, her calm dignity, even in restraints, the way she surveyed the courtroom as if she owned it. Something was terribly wrong with this picture. "Your Honor," Officer Sullivan began, approaching the bench with the practiced confidence of someone who had testified hundreds of times. "I've apprehended a suspect attempting to breach courthouse security. The defendant was acting suspiciously outside the building, refused to provide proper identification when requested, and when confronted about her presence, claimed to be a federal judge." Sullivan's partner, Officer James Rodriguez, nodded from the gallery. They had worked together for 8 years, and Rodriguez had learned that backing Sullivan's version of events was always the safest course. Sullivan had connections in the department, commendations on his wall, and the kind of reputation that could make or break a younger officer's career. Judge Harrison looked down at Ruby, who sat perfectly straight in the defendant's chair despite the handcuffs. There was something unsettling about her composure, the way she seemed more at home in this courtroom than he did. "Ma'am, these are serious charges. Impersonating a federal official is a felony. Do you understand the gravity of your situation?" Ruby met his gaze steadily. "Your Honor, with respect, I believe there has been a profound misunderstanding. If you would allow me to present my identification, this matter could be resolved immediately." "Objection," called Prosecutor Sandra Mills, rising from her table. "The defendant has already demonstrated a willingness to present fraudulent documentation. Officer Sullivan has testified that she was carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents." Sullivan stepped forward again, his confidence building as the narrative took shape. "Your Honor, in my 15 years of law enforcement, I've encountered this exact scenario multiple times. Individuals obtain official-looking documents, sometimes through theft or forgery, and use them to gain unauthorized access to government buildings. The defendant's behavior pattern is consistent with this type of criminal activity." Henderson, the bailiff, shifted uncomfortably. Something about the woman's voice, her mannerisms, was triggering a memory he couldn't quite place. He had seen her before, he was certain of it, but not as a defendant. "Officer Sullivan," Judge Harrison continued, "please describe the defendant's behavior when you first encountered her." Sullivan's eyes gleamed as he warmed to his story. The defendant was approaching the courthouse in what I can only describe as a deliberate, calculated manner. When I requested identification, she became evasive and attempted to reach into her bag without permission. In my experience, this behavior indicates someone with something to hide. "Your Honor," Ruby interjected quietly, "I was reaching for my judicial credentials, which are always kept in my briefcase. Officer Sullivan prevented me from completing that action." "The defendant then claimed to be Judge Ruby Stone," Sullivan continued, ignoring her comment. "A claim that is obviously fraudulent, as anyone familiar with this courthouse would know Judge Stone's appearance and would never mistake this individual for her." Henderson's blood ran cold. He suddenly remembered why the woman looked familiar. He had seen her every working day for 15 years, but always in judicial robes, always elevated behind the bench. Without her official regalia, in street clothes and handcuffs, she had been transformed from authority figure to victim so completely that he had failed to recognize her immediately. Judge Harrison frowned. "Officer, you seem very certain about Judge Stone's appearance. Are you personally acquainted with her?" Sullivan's pause was almost imperceptible, but Ruby caught it. She had spent decades reading the micro-expressions of witnesses and attorneys, and she could see the moment when confidence cracked into uncertainty. "Well, Your Honor, I've had occasion to testify in this courthouse multiple times over my career. I'm familiar with the judicial staff." Sullivan's voice carried less conviction now, as if he was beginning to sense dangerous ground ahead. "I see," Harrison said slowly. "And when was the last time you appeared before Judge Stone?" The question hung in the air like a blade about to fall. Sullivan's mind raced through the years of court appearances, the faces that blurred together, the routine of testimony that had become as automatic as breathing. The truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he had actually looked directly at a judge while testifying. His attention was usually focused on the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the jury when present. Judges were authority figures to be respected, but not necessarily observed. It would have been several months ago, Your Honor. Perhaps longer." Ruby spoke again, her voice carrying a subtle change in tone that made Henderson's recognition complete. "Your Honor, if I may address the court regarding the constitutional issues raised by this unlawful detention?" The phrase was delivered with the precise legal authority of someone who had spent decades controlling courtroom proceedings. Harrison blinked, suddenly hearing not a defendant's plea, but a colleague's professional discourse. "Ma'am, you claim to have legal training?" "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. Served 8 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases, and have presided over this courthouse for 23 years. Ruby's voice never wavered, never became defensive. She stated facts with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her word accepted without question. Henderson could no longer remain silent. He cleared his throat, drawing Judge Harrison's attention. "Your Honor, might I suggest a brief recess? There appears to be some confusion that could be quickly resolved through proper verification procedures." Sullivan shot Henderson a sharp look. In his experience, bailiffs were supposed to maintain order, not interfere with proceedings. "Your Honor, I object to any delay. The defendant is clearly attempting to manipulate the court with false claims and legal jargon she's probably picked up from television." But Henderson was already moving toward the bench, his face pale with the realization of what was unfolding. He had to act before this situation spiraled completely beyond repair. Judge Harrison, sensing the undercurrents of tension he didn't fully understand, made a decision that would change everything. Court will recess for 15 minutes while we verify the defendant's identity through proper channels. As the gavel fell, Ruby Elizabeth Stone sat perfectly still, knowing that justice, like truth, had its own timeline. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse erupted into controlled chaos. Henderson immediately approached Ruby in the holding area adjacent to the courtroom, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his keys. The recognition that had been building throughout the morning crashed over him like a wave of cold horror. "Judge Stone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My God, Judge Stone, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you without your robes, and when they brought you in like that—" His voice trailed off as the magnitude of the situation hit him fully. Ruby looked at Henderson with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout the ordeal. "Thomas, it's not your fault. You weren't part of this. But I need you to do something for me right now." "Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all. Go to my chambers and retrieve my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim hanging behind my desk." "And Thomas," she paused, meeting his eyes directly, "bring my gavel, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and rushed from the room, leaving Ruby alone with her thoughts for the first time since the assault. She closed her eyes and took the deep breaths that had sustained her through decades of difficult decisions. Her grandmother Essie Mae's voice seemed to whisper in the silence, "When they try to break you, baby, that's when you show them what stone women are made of." Meanwhile, in the courthouse corridor, Officer Sullivan was experiencing his first real moment of doubt. The bailiff's reaction, the judge's obvious discomfort, the defendant's unsettling composure, none of it fit the pattern he had expected. Rodriguez approached him with a concerned expression. "Bobby, maybe we should double-check the woman's identification. Something feels off about this whole thing." Sullivan's jaw tightened. "Nothing's off, James. This is textbook criminal behavior. They train these people to act confident, to use legal language, to intimidate us into backing down. We follow procedure, we stick to our testimony, and we let the system work." But even as he spoke the words, Sullivan felt uncertainty creeping into his mind like water through cracks in a foundation. The woman's voice, when she spoke to the judge, there had been something authoritative about it. Something that suggested familiarity with courtroom protocol that went beyond what a career criminal would possess. Ruby's phone, confiscated during the arrest but now returned during the recess, buzzed with increasingly frantic messages. Her clerk, Janet Morrison, had sent a series of texts that painted a picture of growing confusion in the courthouse. "Judge Stone, where are you? The Peterson hearing is scheduled for 9:30. Your Honor, attorneys are asking about delays. Should I reschedule? Judge Stone, there are rumors something happened. Please call immediately." Ruby scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Chief Judge Margaret Carter, the administrative head of the entire judicial district and Ruby's closest friend on the bench. Margaret answered on the first ring. "Ruby, thank God. I've been hearing the most insane rumors about some kind of incident this morning." "Margaret, the rumors are probably true." "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it without asking questions right now." "Of course, whatever you need." Ruby's voice remained steady, but there was an edge of steel that Margaret had never heard before. "I need you to contact courthouse security immediately and tell them to preserve and copy all surveillance footage from this morning between 8:30 and 9:15. All cameras, all angles. Make sure there are multiple copies stored in separate locations." There was a pause. "Ruby, what exactly happened this morning?" "A police officer named Robert Sullivan just spent 45 minutes testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous criminal who was trespassing on courthouse property." Ruby's voice carried the precision of someone who had spent decades choosing words carefully. "The dangerous criminal was me, Margaret, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me on the steps of our courthouse, called me an animal, and told me I didn't belong here." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was tight with controlled rage. "Jesus Christ, Ruby, are you hurt? Should I call the FBI, the Attorney General's office?" "I'm handling it through proper channels right now. But Margaret, I also need you to pull every case Officer Sullivan has testified in over the past 5 years, every single one. Look for patterns in his arrests, his testimony, his use of force reports. Consider it done. But Ruby, you can't preside over your own case. There's a conflict of interest that—" "Margaret," Ruby interrupted, "in about 10 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom wearing my judicial robes. Officer Sullivan is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning, and more importantly, who has the power to ensure he faces the full consequences of his actions." Henderson returned carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box containing Ruby's ceremonial gavel. As she changed into her robes in the small holding room, Ruby felt the familiar weight of authority settling on her shoulders. Each fold of fabric was a reminder of the oath she had taken, the justice she was sworn to protect, the Constitution she had pledged to uphold. The transformation was both physical and psychological. Ruby Elizabeth Stone. The victim was disappearing, replaced by Judge Ruby Elizabeth Stone, a federal jurist with 23 years of experience and the full power of the law behind her decisions. Meanwhile, Sullivan was growing increasingly agitated as the recess stretched on. In his experience, delays always favored the defense, always gave criminals time to concoct new lies or find loopholes. He approached Prosecutor Mills with barely contained frustration. "Counselor, we need to push for immediate sentencing. Every minute we waste gives this woman more opportunity to manipulate the system." Mills nodded, but her confidence was beginning to waver. The defendant's legal knowledge had been impressive, almost unnaturally so for someone supposedly involved in identity theft and trespassing. "Officer Sullivan, you're absolutely certain about the defendant's identity and behavior?" 100%. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know criminal behavior when I see it." But as Sullivan spoke, a young law clerk named Patricia Washington, Ruby's niece, had quietly entered the courthouse for her summer internship. She spotted the commotion outside courtroom 3B and caught sight of Sullivan through the window. Her blood ran cold as she recognized her aunt's voice coming from the holding area, recognized the situation for what it truly was. Patricia immediately called her mother, Ruby's sister Clara, who worked as head nurse at Birmingham General Hospital. Within minutes, word was spreading through the extended Stone family network that Judge Ruby Stone had been assaulted and arrested by a white police officer on the steps of her own courthouse. As the 15-minute recess neared its end, Henderson positioned himself at the courtroom door. He had worked in this building long enough to recognize moments when history was about to be made. Today felt like one of those days. "All rise," Henderson called out, his voice carrying more gravity than usual. "Court is now in session." But what happened next would forever change how everyone in that room understood the relationship between power, justice, and the courage required to stand up to systematic oppression. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and Ruby Elizabeth Stone emerged wearing her full judicial robes, carrying the gavel that symbolized 23 years of dedicated service to the law. Officer Sullivan, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, suddenly found himself face to face with the person whose life he had just tried to destroy. The silence that followed was so complete that the air conditioning system sounded like thunder. Henderson's voice carried through the packed courtroom with unprecedented gravity. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire, and what had begun as a routine morning hearing had transformed into something extraordinary. Lawyers, clerks, court reporters, and local citizens had quietly filled every available seat, drawn by whispers of the most spectacular reversal of justice in Birmingham's legal history. Ruby Elizabeth Stone entered through the judge's chamber's door, her judicial robes flowing around her with the dignity of 23 years of service. The gold trim caught the overhead lights as she moved with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried the ceremonial gavel that had been presented to her on her first day as a federal judge, engraved with the words her grandfather had chosen, "Justice sees all." The silence was absolute. Not a single person in the courtroom dared to breathe as Ruby took her place behind the bench that bore her nameplate. Her eyes swept the room methodically, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just transpired. Officer Robert Sullivan, who moments before had been leaning confidently against the prosecutor's table, now stood frozen in place. His face had gone through a spectrum of colors, red to white to green, as the reality crashed over him like a tsunami. The woman he had called an animal, the person he had slammed against the courthouse wall, the defendant he had just finished destroying with his testimony, was now sitting in the position of ultimate authority in this courtroom. "Officer Sullivan," Ruby said quietly, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority that had commanded respect for more than 2 decades. "You may remain standing." The words hit Sullivan like physical blows. His legs began to shake uncontrollably as he realized that his entire world was about to collapse around him. His attorney, a nervous public defender named Michael Carter, who had been hastily summoned, looked as though he might faint. Judge Harrison, the temporary judge who had been presiding, rose from his chair with the stunned expression of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. "Your Honor, we didn't... I mean to say..." He couldn't form complete sentences as the implications of the morning's events became clear. "Judge Harrison," Ruby said, her tone professional but not unkind, "thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket. I'll handle this matter from here." Harrison practically fled from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him like he was being chased by the ghost of justice itself. The door closed behind him with a finality that seemed to seal Sullivan's fate. Ruby turned her attention back to Sullivan, who was now visibly trembling. "Officer Sullivan, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this very courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Sullivan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. The confident police officer who had dominated the morning session had vanished, replaced by a broken man who was finally beginning to understand the depth of his mistake. "Let me refresh your memory," Ruby continued, reaching beneath her bench to retrieve a tablet computer. "You stated, and I quote from the court transcript, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' Do you remember saying that, Officer Sullivan?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Sullivan managed a weak nod, his voice completely gone. "You also testified that I was, and again I quote, 'another activist looking for a payday,' and that you had seen this playbook before. Is that accurate?" Ruby's voice remained perfectly controlled, but there was an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the courtroom understand they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a case being tried. This was justice itself being served after decades of being denied. "And perhaps most memorably," Ruby continued, her voice growing colder with each word, "you stated that people like me need to learn that actions have consequences. Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom, Officer Sullivan?" Sullivan's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed into the defendant's chair, the same chair where Ruby had been forced to sit in handcuffs just hours earlier. The irony was so complete, so perfect, that several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Ruby stood from her bench and walked to the evidence table, her movements deliberate and commanding. "Officer Sullivan, I'd like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." She picked up the tablet and turned its screen toward the courtroom, revealing crystal-clear security camera footage from the courthouse steps. This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which maintains an unobstructed view of the main entrance. Her finger touched the screen, starting the video that would destroy Sullivan's life. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as the morning's events unfolded in high definition. There was Ruby, walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes, briefcase in hand, the picture of professional dignity. Then there was Sullivan, blocking her path with obvious hostility. His voice, clear as day, filled the courtroom through the tablet speakers. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in where she doesn't belong." Several people in the gallery stood up and walked out in disgust. Those who remained watched in stunned silence as the video continued, showing Sullivan's unprovoked assault in vivid, undeniable detail. The slap that snapped Ruby's head sideways, the brutal grab to her throat, the unnecessary force of the handcuffs, all of it captured with the clarity of modern surveillance technology. But the most damning moment was yet to come. Sullivan's voice, filled with venom and hatred, echoed through the courtroom. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning any remaining doubt about Sullivan's character or motivations. Ruby paused the video and set the tablet down, allowing the full impact of Sullivan's own words to settle over the room. "Officer Sullivan," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of federal law, "do you see any verbal aggression from the victim in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats? Any behavior that would justify your actions?" Sullivan remained silent, his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes like a house of cards in a hurricane. Ruby reached beneath her bench and withdrew a thick manila folder that seemed to contain the weight of decades. The courtroom remained silent as she opened it slowly, deliberately, her movements carrying the gravity of someone about to deliver judgment not just on one man, but on an entire system of abuse. "Officer Sullivan," she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "let's examine your distinguished career in law enforcement, shall we?" Sullivan's attorney leaned forward to whisper urgently in his client's ear, but Sullivan seemed paralyzed, unable to respond to anything happening around him. The confident police officer who had dominated the morning session had completely disappeared, replaced by a broken man watching his world collapse in real time. "According to records from Internal Affairs, you've been the subject of 47 formal complaints during your 20-year career." Ruby pulled out a document and held it up for the courtroom to see. 47 complaints, Officer Sullivan. That averages to more than 2 complaints per year for your entire career. The packed gallery stirred uneasily. Local news reporters, who had heard whispers of the extraordinary proceedings, were frantically taking notes while trying to maintain courtroom decorum. "Let's start with complaint number 1, filed in 2004, Ruby continued, her voice steady and prosecutorial. "Mrs. Rosa Martinez, a 63-year-old grandmother, alleged that you called her a wetback during a routine traffic stop and slammed her face into her car hood when she asked for your badge number." Ruby looked directly at Sullivan, who had gone completely pale. "Your department's investigation concluded that Mrs. Martinez's allegations were unsubstantiated. Interesting, considering we now have video evidence of you using remarkably similar language and tactics with me." She flipped to another page, her movements deliberate and damning. Complaint number 12, filed in 2009. Jamal Washington, a 17-year-old honor student, alleged that you planted drugs in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his older brother. Once again, your department found the complaint unsubstantiated. Sullivan's breathing was becoming increasingly labored as each revelation built upon the last, creating a mountain of evidence that he could no longer deny or explain away. Complaint number 23, filed in 2016, Ruby continued relentlessly. Dr. Michael Johnson, yes, Dr. Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, alleged that you arrested him outside his own home because you didn't believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Dr. Johnson spent 6 hours in jail before his attorney could secure his release. Ruby closed the file with a sharp snap that echoed through the silent courtroom. What was the department's finding on that complaint, Officer Sullivan? Sullivan's voice came out as barely a whisper. Unsubstantiated. Unsubstantiated, Ruby repeated, her voice dripping with disgust. Are you beginning to see a pattern here, Officer Sullivan? Chief Judge Margaret Carter had quietly entered the courtroom and was now sitting in the front row, her expression grim as she witnessed the systematic destruction of a police officer's career. But more than that, she was watching the exposure of a system that had protected abusers for decades. But here's what's really interesting, Officer Sullivan, Ruby continued, pulling out a large chart and placing it on an easel where everyone could see it. I've cross-referenced your complaint record with your arrest statistics, and some fascinating patterns emerge. The chart showed a breakdown of Sullivan's arrests by race, ethnicity, and outcome. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Over your 20-year career, you've made 1,247 arrests. Of those arrests, 1,089, that's 87%, involved people of color. Meanwhile, the demographics of your patrol area are 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. Ruby pointed to different sections of the chart with a laser pointer, her presentation as methodical and devastating as any closing argument she had ever delivered as a prosecutor. Even more interesting, your use of force reports show that you used physical force in 63% of your arrests involving people of color, compared to only 12% of your arrests involving white suspects. Sullivan's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how many years his client was facing and whether any defense was even possible at this point. And here's perhaps the most damning statistic of all, Ruby continued, her voice growing colder with each revelation. Of your 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or violations of constitutional rights. That's a dismissal rate of nearly 40%. She turned back to Sullivan, who was now slumped in his chair like a man who had been physically beaten. Officer Sullivan, do you know what we call it when a police officer has a 40% dismissal rate due to constitutional violations? Sullivan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. We call it a pattern of criminal behavior, Ruby answered for him. The courtroom was deadly silent, except for the scratch of reporters' pens on paper and the quiet sobbing of someone in the back row who had clearly been one of Sullivan's victims. But wait, Ruby said, her tone taking on an almost conversational quality that made her next words even more devastating. There's more. She pulled out another document, this one bearing the seal of the county treasurer's office. I've also reviewed the financial impact of your career on the taxpayers of this county, Officer Sullivan. Ruby held up the document so the entire courtroom could see the figures. Over the past 20 years, this county has paid out $2.3 million in settlements and judgments related to your conduct. $2.3 million, Officer Sullivan. That's more than some small towns' entire annual budgets. The number hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be denied. Taxpayer money, money that could have gone to schools, roads, or community programs, had instead been used to cover up Sullivan's pattern of abuse. Officer Sullivan, Ruby said, setting down the document and looking directly at him, let me read you the oath you took when you became a police officer. She pulled out an official document and read aloud, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional authority. I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office according to the best of my ability. So help me God. Ruby set the document down and stared at Sullivan. Faithfully and impartially, Officer Sullivan, not selectively, not based on skin color, not based on your personal prejudices. The weight of 20 years of violated oaths, broken trust, and systematic abuse pressed down on the courtroom like a physical force. This wasn't just about one morning's assault, this was about decades of unchecked power and the inevitable corruption that followed. But Ruby wasn't finished. The worst revelation was yet to come. Ruby walked around the bench, stepping down to address the packed courtroom directly. Her movement was deliberate, transforming the formal judicial proceeding into something more intimate and devastating. This wasn't just a sentencing. This was a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. "Officer Sullivan," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers like him were held accountable. "Before we proceed with the serious criminal charges you now face, I believe this court and everyone present deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." The gallery was completely silent, every person leaning forward to catch her words. News cameras, initially banned from the courtroom, had been quietly permitted by Chief Judge Carter, who understood that this moment needed to be witnessed by the broader community. "My name is Judge Ruby Elizabeth Stone. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2001, and I was confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous vote." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, as she continued. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I served as editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." Sullivan's attorney had stopped taking notes entirely, probably realizing that no defense strategy could overcome the mountain of evidence being presented against his client. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor," Ruby continued, "I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional racism. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority." She paused, letting that number sink in. The irony was profound. Sullivan had assaulted the very person who had built her career prosecuting officers exactly like him. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every justification." Ruby moved closer to where Sullivan sat, her presence commanding and inescapable. "But in all my years of service, Officer Sullivan, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect example of everything that is wrong with policing in America." The words hit Sullivan like physical blows. His shoulders shook as the full weight of his situation became clear. He had not just assaulted a random citizen, he had assaulted the person most equipped to destroy his career and expose his pattern of abuse. "You see, Officer Sullivan," Ruby continued, "when you called me a ghetto rat and a filthy animal, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen." She returned to her position behind the bench, opening a thick file that had been placed there during the recess. "You were assaulting the person who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers like you are held accountable for their actions." Ruby lifted the file, its thickness immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. "This file contains detailed records of every case you've testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases, Officer Sullivan. 43 times you've stood in my courtroom and sworn to tell the truth." She flipped through several pages, her movements deliberate and theatrical. 28 of those cases involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the arresting officer. And in every single one, Officer Sullivan, you described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used with me this morning. Ruby's voice took on a prosecutorial edge that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, threatening officers' safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies over and over again. She closed the file with a sharp snap that echoed through the silent courtroom. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Sullivan. Ruby reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an official document bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sight of it made Sullivan's face go completely white. For the past 6 months, I've been working with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Justice to investigate systematic patterns of racial bias and misconduct in this police department. Sullivan's breathing became ragged as the implications hit him. This wasn't just about one morning's assault. This was about a federal investigation that had been building for months. Your name, Officer Sullivan, appears on a federal watch list. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been analyzed. Ruby's voice grew colder with each revelation. And this morning, Officer Sullivan, you provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could hope for. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as the full scope of Sullivan's predicament became clear. Yeah, he wasn't just facing charges for assault. He was facing federal civil rights violations that could put him in prison for decades. But Ruby wasn't finished. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. Officer Sullivan, she said, pulling out another file, this one marked "Confidential" in red letters. There's something else you need to know about this morning's events. Something that makes your actions not just criminal, but personally unconscionable. She opened the file slowly, dramatically, as Sullivan watched with the expression of a man awaiting his execution. 15 years ago, when I was still practicing law before my appointment to the bench, I took on pro bono cases involving troubled youth in the Birmingham area. Young people who had made mistakes but deserved second chances. Ruby pulled out a photograph and held it up for the courtroom to see. It showed a younger version of herself standing next to a teenage boy outside the courthouse, both of them smiling at the camera. This is Marcus Sullivan, Officer Sullivan, your son. When he was 17 years old, he was arrested for drug possession and facing mandatory minimum sentencing that would have destroyed his future. Sullivan's head snapped up, his eyes focusing on Ruby for the first time since her identity had been revealed. The color drained completely from his face as he stared at the photograph of his son. I spent 6 months fighting for Marcus, Officer Sullivan. 6 months of my life, working without pay, to ensure that your son received treatment instead of prison time, rehabilitation instead of punishment. I saved your son's future. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped working as the full irony of the situation became clear. Marcus is now a successful attorney, Officer Sullivan. He graduated from law school last year and works for the Southern Poverty Law Center, fighting the same kind of injustice you perpetrated this morning. Ruby set the photograph down and looked directly at Sullivan, whose face was now streaked with tears of shock and realization. This morning, Officer Sullivan, you assaulted the woman who saved your son's life. The revelation about Marcus Sullivan hung in the courtroom air like a thunderbolt that refused to dissipate. Officer Sullivan sat completely motionless, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of Ruby's words sank in. The woman he had brutalized, the person he had called an animal, had once been his family's salvation. Ruby allowed the silence to stretch, understanding that some truths needed time to penetrate decades of hatred and prejudice. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a different quality. Not the prosecutorial edge of earlier, but something deeper, more personal. "Officer Sullivan," she said quietly, "your son Marcus doesn't know what happened here today. He doesn't know that his father assaulted the woman who saved his future. But he will know, because justice requires truth, and truth requires transparency." Sullivan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Judge Stone, I didn't know. Marcus never told me your name. He just said a lawyer helped him, someone who believed in second chances." "That's because I asked him not to," Ruby replied, her tone measured but not unkind. "Client confidentiality extends beyond the courtroom, Officer Sullivan. I never discuss my cases, especially when they involve young people trying to rebuild their lives." She paused, allowing the irony to sink in fully. "Your son has spent the last 15 years believing that the system can work, that justice can be fair, that people can change. This morning, you've proven him wrong on every count." The courtroom door opened quietly, and Marcus Sullivan entered, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror as he took in the scene before him. At 28, he bore a strong resemblance to his father, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had overcome early mistakes and built a meaningful career. "Dad?" Marcus called out, his voice uncertain as he approached the defendant's table. "I got a call that there was some kind of incident." His voice trailed off as he recognized Ruby sitting behind the judge's bench. The confusion on his face transformed into shock, then understanding, then a kind of grief that seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. "Judge Stone?" Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "My father. He's the one who—" Ruby nodded gravely. "I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way, Marcus, but you deserve to know the truth." Marcus turned to face his father, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and profound disappointment. "Dad, how could you? Judge Stone saved my life. She's the reason I became a lawyer. She's the reason I believe in justice." Sullivan couldn't meet his son's eyes. 20 years of anger and prejudice crumbled like a house built on sand as he faced the consequences of his actions. Not just legal consequences, but the loss of his son's respect, the destruction of everything he thought he was fighting to protect. "Marcus," Sullivan said, his voice thick with tears, "I thought I was protecting our family. I thought I was honoring your grandfather's memory. I thought—" "You thought what, Dad?" Marcus's voice was rising with emotion. "You thought beating up innocent people was honoring anything. You thought destroying lives was protecting our family." Ruby lifted her gavel, the sound immediately drawing attention back to the bench. "Marcus, I understand this is difficult, but I need to proceed with sentencing. Officer Sullivan has committed serious crimes, and justice cannot wait for family reconciliation." Marcus nodded, tears now flowing freely down his face. "I understand, Your Honor. I need him to know that everything I've become, everything I've tried to build my career on, was inspired by your example." The idea that the law could be fair, that justice could be compassionate but firm. He turned back to his father. "You attacked my hero, Dad. You attacked the person who taught me that the system could work if good people were willing to fight for it." Ruby stood from her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her as she prepared to deliver the judgment that would close this chapter and hopefully open a new one for the community. "Officer Robert Sullivan," she began, her voice carrying the full weight of 23 years of judicial authority. "Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own recorded statements, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony." The words echoed through the packed courtroom like hammer blows. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Sullivan's attorney had given up any pretense of defense, simply sitting in stunned silence as his client's life was systematically dismantled. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Sullivan seemed to shrink further into himself, the weight of his crimes crushing whatever remained of his former confidence. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Ruby paused, letting the charges settle over the room like a shroud. But Officer Sullivan, this case was never really about you. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery, her voice rising with passion and purpose. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid settlements while allowing the abuse to continue. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom, but that ends today. What happened in this courtroom today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians, no one. Ruby lifted her gavel high above her head, the moment seeming to stretch into eternity. Officer Robert Sullivan, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with the sound of thunder, and with it, 2 decades of unchecked abuse finally met their reckoning. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally spoken. 6 months after that historic day in Birmingham, the ripple effects continued to transform not just the police department, but the entire community's understanding of justice and redemption. Officer Sullivan was serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Montgomery, where he had become an unlikely leader in prisoner rehabilitation programs. His transformation behind bars was as complete as his fall from grace had been swift. Ruby Elizabeth Stone sat in her chambers on her final day as a federal judge, preparing for the retirement ceremony that would mark the end of an extraordinary career. At 59, she had decided it was time to step down, not in defeat, but in triumph. The morning's events 6 months ago had accomplished more than 23 years of individual cases ever could. They had exposed and begun to heal systematic wounds that had festered for generations. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Marcus Sullivan stood in the doorway, no longer the shocked young man who had watched his father's world collapse, but someone who had found peace through understanding and forgiveness. "Judge Stone," he said, holding an envelope, "I wanted to give you this before the ceremony today. It's from my father." Ruby accepted the letter with the same grace she had shown throughout the ordeal. Sullivan's handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of someone who had taken time to choose each word with precision. "Dear Judge Stone," the letter began, "I know that no words can undo the harm I caused you, my family, and our community. I know that 25 years in prison cannot restore the dignity I tried to steal from you. But I need you to know that your response to my hatred has taught me more about justice than 20 years of police work ever did. You could have destroyed me with revenge, but instead, you chose to heal our community with truth. Marcus visits me every month, and through his eyes, I'm finally beginning to understand the man you helped him become. The man I should have been. Thank you for saving my son and for showing me that redemption is possible even for someone like me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the forgiveness you've already given." Ruby folded the letter carefully, her eyes moist with tears she hadn't expected. Forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was the most powerful force for change she had ever witnessed. The retirement ceremony took place in the courthouse lobby, the same space where portraits of civil rights heroes had watched over decades of legal proceedings. Chief Judge Carter delivered the formal remarks, but it was Marcus Sullivan who provided the most moving tribute. "Judge Stone taught me that the law isn't just about punishment," he told the gathered crowd. "It's about transformation. She saved my life when I was 17, and 6 months ago, she saved my father's soul." Ruby's sister Clara, her nephew Jamal, and her extended Stone family filled the front rows, their faces beaming with pride. The community had embraced this moment not as an ending, but as a beginning, the start of a new chapter in Birmingham's long journey toward justice. As the ceremony concluded, Ruby walked slowly through the courthouse one final time. In courtroom 3B, workers were installing a bronze plaque that would commemorate the events of that historic morning. The inscription was simple but powerful. Here, justice finally found its voice. But the most meaningful moment came as Ruby reached the courthouse steps where everything had begun. A small group had gathered there, former victims of police misconduct, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by her example. They had come not to celebrate her retirement, but to commit themselves to continuing the work of justice. Among them stood Sarah Sullivan, Bobby's daughter, hand in hand with Jamal Washington, Ruby's nephew. Their relationship, which had begun in secret fear of family disapproval, now represented hope for a generation that refused to inherit their parents' prejudices. "Judge Stone," Sarah called out, "Jamal and I wanted you to know that we're planning to name our first child after you. Ruby, if it's a girl, Stone, if it's a boy." Ruby felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just happiness or pride, it was the deep satisfaction of knowing that seeds planted in justice could bloom into love. As the sun set over Birmingham, painting the courthouse steps in golden light, Ruby Elizabeth Stone walked home for the last time as a federal judge. But her real work, the work of healing hearts and building bridges, was just beginning. The case that had begun with hatred and ended with healing proved that America's promise of justice for all wasn't just an ideal to aspire to, it was a reality that good people could create. One difficult conversation, one act of forgiveness, one moment of courage at a time. In the end, that's what mattered most, not the punishment of the guilty, but the healing of the innocent, and the transformation of a community willing to face its past in order to build a better future. This story reminds us that true strength isn't found in holding grudges, but in choosing forgiveness without forgetting the lessons learned. As Americans who've lived through decades of change, you understand that progress comes not from perfect people, but from those willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Judge Stone's response shows us that dignity and grace can triumph over hatred and ignorance, proving that the values we've fought for throughout our lives, equality, justice, and compassion, still have the power to transform hearts and communities. Questions for reflection. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone chose forgiveness over revenge, and how did it change the situation? What lessons from your own life experiences have taught you that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, ultimately leads to positive change? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom and experiences matter.